Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unofficial Gilded Age After Show. I am Kelsie Paul, Manager of Interpretation and Engagement at the Frick Pittsburgh. I am joined by three very special guests this week, which I'm very excited about. First, we have Elizabeth Barker, who is our Executive Director at the Frick Pittsburgh. We also have Dawn Reed Brean, who is our Chief Curator and Director of Collections. And then we also have a very special guest with us, Howard Zar, who is the Executive Director of Lindhurst. And we're going to talk all about Lindhurst in just a little bit. I'm so glad that all three of you were able to join us for our conversation about episode 3 of the Gilded Age. I always like to start out these conversations with a brief synopsis, so we're sort of on board with what we're talking about. In episode 3, we saw George face a surprise development. Meanwhile, Marion sees Mr. Rakes against Agnes's wishes, and Ada runs into an old friend. Elsewhere, Peggy gets an opportunity. And we are definitely going to talk about the surprise development that George has to deal with. That was a huge part of the episode, and we will absolutely get to it. But we have some other things that we wanted to chat about first. First among them being Lynhurst and the site's sort of starring role in this episode in particular. Howard's been telling us sort of some behind the scenes stories of how this all happened. And, Howard, you were talking about the fact that Lynhurst essentially in this episode, in episode 3, sort of serves as the set for the Fein House. We see it a couple of times. We see the art gallery in the house. We see the dining room in the scene when Marion and Ada go to lunch. So can you start by just sort of helping our viewers to understand where Lindhurst is, where Lindhurst's story sort of fits into the story of the Gilded Age, and sort of the history behind it and this whole time period?
Certainly. Happy to do that. And thank you so much for having me today. Lynhurst is very interesting because it is actually the historic summer home of Jay Gould, who is one of the railroad barons of the Gilded Age, and who is very much the inspiration for the lead character, George Russell. So if you want to understand where the non-fictional George Russell actually lived, you can come to Lindhurst and you can see it. And what's even interesting is we have a number of portraits of Jay Gould in the house, and it is almost shocking how much they look like Morgan Spector, the actor who is actually playing Jay Gould. Lynhurst is not actually a Gilded Age house. It was originally built in 1838 by Alexander Jackson Davis. So it's a very early house. It's more than 175 years old. But Jay Gould bought it in 1880 at the same time that he buys a new brownstone on Fifth Avenue. And so much of the decoration, particularly in things like the Grand Picture Gallery, it's Jay Gould's paintings collection that he bought from Goupil and Knoedler, and it's still intact and it's still in place. So you really get a very good sense at Lindhurst of how the country developed into the Gilded Age, because it's a house first done in 1838, then redone in 1864 to 1868, and then redecorated with paintings and stained glass windows by Tiffany in 1880.
And we see sort of all of that beauty, I think, in the episode. It's really showcased. You were telling us that the two big scenes, we see Clara Barton giving a talk in what is Lynhurst's art gallery. So that's sort of the first kind of major scene that we see in this episode. And then, of course, the dining scene. You were telling us a little bit, though, about sort of the challenges of filming a show like the Gilded Age in a actual historic mansion, because the furniture, the artwork, those are all historic pieces. You can't have people sit on those. So can you tell us a little bit about how that worked with figuring out how to make a film set work in a historic mansion?
Completely. So one of the things about Lindhurst is we have filmed at Lindhurst for a very long time. I believe the first film projects are in 1970 and 71. They're the Dark Shadows movies. And what's interesting at that time is it's Lindhurst before it was redone as a museum. And you see the last iteration of how the family lived in the house in that filming. So we have a lot of experience at doing that. And it's also, we're a 67-acre estate with 15 buildings. So not everything is only in the mansion. So for example, the very opening shot of the Gilded Age, when, excuse me, you see the horse cart going through Sheep Meadow in Central Park, delivering a sculpture to the Russell Mansion. That's Lyndhurst. So the exterior sets in for Central Park because Lyndhurst's exterior was designed in the 1860s as Central Park was being completed, and it was essentially supposed to be a private Central Park. The ferry terminal is a CGI version of our bowling alley. And I know that both Lyndhurst and for Pittsburgh have bowling alleys of about the same period that are standalone buildings, which is very unusual. So we film in many buildings and on the outside. Now in the mansion, because we've done this so regularly, we actually know which pieces are period, which pieces are modern reproductions. So there are certain things that can be left and sat on, but other things have to be moved. It's actually much easier nowadays to do it than it was in the past because the lighting is so much simpler. And in the past, the lighting could burn down a historic house. It was a real concern. That is not the case anymore. So we're really able to do it very seamlessly with them.
That's fantastic. I was watching, I saw some behind the scenes photos that you guys had posted at Lynhurst sort of about the process. And I was thinking about it in the context of Clayton and what that would entail. Our spaces, I think, are somewhat smaller than Lynhurst, but gosh, that is just a lot of stuff to worry about. I imagine, Dawn, that would be quite a headache for you.
Yeah,
well,
it was fascinating to see the photos of how you protected the interior and all of these little details that I think the audience can't appreciate without seeing that post and what goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting because we are similarly sized as Clayton. I think one of the points that's very interesting about this production is, generally speaking, there's a lot of things that Lynhurst serves. In this episode, we were the Fein House. So we're essentially a country house serving as a city house. And places like Clayton and Lynhurst really are built before the huge expansion that you get. A lot of those Newport mansions that are shown here and that they use rooms from really are built in the 1890s and the 1900s. So things just get gigantic. By comparison, the Lindhurst dining room that was the scene with Kelly O'Hara and Cynthia Nixon, that at its largest seats 14 people. The Breakers Mansion dining room seats 300. So we are a relatively small space. And one of the challenges for the production was they couldn't actually use us for some of the more major houses because we were actually too small to film in.
right.
One of the interesting things, though, in this production is that, so for example, some of the things that had to be done when the scene is filmed in the picture gallery, they actually took down half the paintings that were there because I think for the contemporary eye, the Victorian hanging from floor to ceiling, every inch covered with paintings, was a little too busy for television and broadcast. So you only see half of what we have. And you'll also notice they put paintings across the Tiffany windows at the front of the picture gallery where the meeting is being held. Now that was historically done. And interesting, one of the paintings is actually a painting by Innes of the Lackawanna Valley. So it actually relates to Clayton. But the reason it's done also is because that window is so massive, it allows in so much light for glare that during the filming, it helped them control that glare, and they did it in a period way.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And we talked a little bit about, art collecting in our last episode. We talked about the trend among America's wealthy in the Gilded Age in art collecting. Obviously, Jay Gould was an art collector. To have an art gallery in his summer home, we know Mr. Frick was a art collector as well. Dawn, I was thinking about images that we've seen of Clayton, where it's that, like what Howard is saying, that floor to ceiling, much more sort of, busy sort of picture hanging, but Clayton didn't have an art gallery per se. It wasn't that the Fricks were hanging art in a specific room. That comes later with the Frick collection, where Mr. Frick is sort of being more purposeful about creating a space for that, right?
Yes, definitely. And we do have interior shots. We know that when Frick is buying paintings in the 1890s, he is putting them over windows. They're closing draperies and hanging paintings in front of them. They're closing doors and hanging paintings on doors, using every single flat wall space they could really for display, even though they didn't have a gallery. So I couldn't help but notice the paintings on the windows and watching those scenes, and was curious about their placement, but it didn't seem totally out of the ordinary for the time period.
It seems like it's partially movie magic, keeping the glare out, but also pretty accurate for how they would have done it. So one of the other things that we see in this episode is a really fun sort of middle moment where we get to see a little bit of the world outside of the mansions that we've been sort of hanging out in, outside of the Russell House and outside of the Van Ryn home. We get to see the Magic Lantern show, which we thought was such a fun inclusion for the episode and sort of builds out, I think, the world of the Gilded Age a little bit, and demonstrates some of the entertainment options that were available to people. And there's moments throughout the episode where that's mentioned. And Lizzie, I know you in particular were really excited to see the Magic Lantern show sort of included in this episode. I think it's worth filling it in for people. What the heck is a Magic Lantern show? They don't really explain it in the episode.
Isn't it a wonderful name? I think I would rush out to see a Magic Lantern show, whereas if someone said a slide projector show, I might pause for a moment. So this is a technology that had been around for a long time, but it becomes possible for it to be exciting when all of a sudden lighting technology improves. So some of the things you might have seen in a Magic Lantern show would be images from the Civil War. You might see scenes from literature. This is a scene from Ben-Hur, from one of Queen Victoria's favorite poems, a sentimental story about a young woman who, by physically stopping the town bell from ringing, prevents her beloved from being executed at sunrise during the British Civil War, something that could perhaps be adapted for a future costume drama. Scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's always interesting to reflect on the fact that the book had a huge impact, but not necessarily because everyone was reading it. Many people were seeing plays or musicals, singing songs about it, or watching these wonderful Magic Lantern shows. There were special performances for children. In many ways, just as in the 1980s, and I'm dating myself here, you could rent a VCR as well as the tapes before they were commonly owned. You could rent for an overnight or a weekend a Magic Lantern. And you might just show these amusing drolls. This is an image of courtship, a scandal for some folks in the household. Or you might take advantage of the fact that you could have moving images. And in the episode, which is a charming courtship scene with Jack and Bridget, we see the projector moving down the aisle to create a really dramatic effect. Most of the effects were not quite as fancy as we have the illusion that they would be. This is an image of a shipwreck, and the special effect is this fabulous wave movement, which just goes on and on. Of course, the highlight of the scene is when a train comes on screen, and it's so dramatic. It's a little bit like going to the IMAX now, and gives a chance for a young couple perhaps to have some physical context. What we see is very dramatic in the HBO show, but this is a little more what might have been seen then.
That's, I think, from doing a little bit of reading about it, there was often either live narration involved, or there would be music or sort of slight sound effects. And it really is, from my understanding, a precursor to motion picture. This is a really kind of right before the motion picture. And thanks, Lizzie, for sharing those images with us too. That's really helpful to sort of see the actual thing. What's so interesting about it, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, is that we're getting to see sort of different ways that Americans are spending their time or spending their leisure time. And we have that. I think it's sort of really interestingly juxtaposed with the conversation that we actually have Howard in the dining room at Lindhurst, which is the brief conversation that we get about the opera and the battle over the Academy of Music and what will eventually become the Metropolitan Opera. And we talked about the fact that the way that leisure is happening is very different depending on what class that you're in. And Dawn, you had a comment. You didn't know that our sort of main characters, the wealthy characters in the show, would be going to a magic lantern show necessarily, but people like Bridget and Jack, that is exactly the type of entertainment that they are pursuing because it's more affordable for them to do, and so it's a little bit more accessible to sort of the masses in a way.
Yeah, I can see our upper class characters thinking that the Magic Lantern show is inappropriate or too vulgar. So for the lower classes, which I find really entertaining because it seems like Jack and Bridget are really enjoying themselves and enjoying the Magic Lantern show, whereas when the upper class families are going to the opera, they aren't necessarily going to listen to opera. It's just another form of conspicuous consumption. Having your own opera box was a visible sign of your wealth and your status, and you would dress for the occasion, and you would, wear your best gowns and jewelry and show off, and you kind of mingle gossip over everybody else's dresses. So I love seeing and hearing the highbrow and lowbrow entertainment.
And we talked to, there's a brief moment where, Jack and Bridget talk about the fact that they have their one night out. They sort of have to negotiate it with the head butler about the fact that can they both have the same night out at the same time. And we talked a little bit yesterday about the reality of that, the fact that depending on, sort of what class you're living in the Gilded Age, your leisure time looks really different. And, Howard, you had made an interesting comment about the fact, the elaborate way that the people dined in the upper class, that dining is a really sort of long drawn out sort of what Dawn is saying, performative thing, whereas the domestic staff, they're eating, they're getting it done, and then they're moving on to the next thing. So just even what you're even your daytime, just day-to-day activities are different depending on which class you're a part of.
Yeah, I think, one thing I would make as a general comment, I think Lord Fellows, who writes these, is really a subversive radical, because he, people think he's writing just costume dramas and talking about the opera and gossip, but he's really showing how society changes and how people's lives are impacted. Because I think what Lizzie talked about a moment ago, she's showing the future. He's showing what entertainment would become for everybody, which it isn't at that time. And I think what's really very interesting about the upper classes and how he's portraying them is what I think they had as entertainment was the ability to talk with each other. And the way these houses and these estates are used, they are the entertainment of your upper crust. You have the landscape, the walks in them, the flowers that you know about. You have your greenhouses, as we were talking about before. You built a private bowling alley or a tennis court that you could take advantage of. But in particular, you had the whole ritual of eating together. These meals were often 9 courses. You had to dress for the meals specifically. There was the houses were designed for these meals. So at Lindhurst, for example, the parlor is down a long hallway from the dining room, and you gather in the parlor, you walk down a hallway, the double doors are flung open, the table is set there, the room is glittering, you come in, and then you sat for hours, and then afterwards, the men retreated to smoke cigars, the women retreated to their parlor. That was the entertainment. You wouldn't have done something as vulgar as sit cheek and jowl with people who you didn't know who might give you a disease. So I think, but that is what everybody does now.
Right.
So I think what this show does, it's not just melodrama. It's really about the significant changes that affect all of us through history. And that's why I love it. And I think this is a good example of subtle ways in which this is being woven in.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about so much of what becomes sort of defining aspects of sort of modern 20th century America really is born in the Gilded Age, whether it's the technology like, film and motion pictures and electricity and the telephone, or, the way that corporations are run. It's really a defining period and sets up the 20th century to become what it is. And I love that point, that I think that we're seeing that throughout the show, sort of woven in little ways. I want to segue us to George's showdown with the aldermen, because I think it is obviously a huge part of the conversation and a part of the episode today. It's a major plot point. We saw George sort of orchestrate this deal with the aldermen to get this law passed so that he can move forward with building his new train station. He thinks that everything is, going according to plan. And then Bertha comes in and says, they're saying in the newspaper that things are not going according to plan, and sort of news to him. And so what we see play out after that is sort of the back and forth and the sort of scheming and moves that have to be made on both sides to sort of get to the end result. And we've talked a lot about the fact, that George, Russell is based on Jay Gould. Howard, how does Jay Gould sort of actual personality and kind of who he was, where do you see that sort of in the episode in particular, and how George handles this whole situation?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that are very interesting, and it's one of the reasons that when Julian Fellowes talks about creating this character, he was very drawn to Jay Gould. In person, in real life, Jay Gould was a self-made man, and a lot of these other people, while they were new, they were not brand new to society in New York. So he was on the outs, and he was doing the same thing that everybody did, but he had bad publicity. Now, one of the big differences between Jay Gould and many of his counterparts is that he was actually a loving husband and a loving father. Under the code of the day, many of these men womenized relentlessly, which Jay Gould did not. He treated his daughters equally to his sons. And I think one of the interesting things that you see in this episode is the way that Jay Gould treats his wife. They are consulting with each other about matters of business. He holds her in high esteem in that matter. Whereas when you look at the Morrises, he doesn't actually tell Mrs. Morris what's going on. He tells her what to do, but he does not actually consult with her. Right. So I think that is a very important thing that he does. Now, in reality, Jay Gould was ruthless in business, but so were all his other competitors. And I think the thing to remember here is the aldermen were as ruthless as he was. What a lot of people don't know is many of the business tactics that we consider illegal today were perfectly legal at that point. It's only till Franklin Roosevelt hires Joe Kennedy and establishes the Securities and Exchange Commission that these in 1929 that these things are made illegal. And he hires Joe Kennedy because Joe Kennedy was, in his day, the meanest, dirtiest guy on Wall Street, and he knew all the dirty tricks. So he was the one who got rid of them. So what you're actually seeing is the tit for tat that was very common to all these people at the time. Jay Gould historically had much worse PR because he wasn't part of the club.
That's a really good point. This idea of being an insider or an outsider. And, you're right. The aldermen are doing dirty tricks just as much as George is. Of course, they're insiders. They're in the old money kind of club. But unfortunately for them, it just doesn't work out in their favor in this particular instance. George kind of comes out on top. And, Dawn and Lizzie, I'm interested to hear sort of your thoughts on this, because we often talk about this within the context of Mr. Frick, this sort of, public persona that he had, which, like Jay Gould, he had a reputation for being exacting and, sort of ruthless in business. But we know him being, the place of his family life as, a family man and having this sort of whole other life from his public life. And we talk a lot about that within the context of what does make a good businessman. Do you have to be that ruthless in order to be successful? And I'd be interested to hear kind of Lizzie and Dawn sort of what your thoughts on that, and also how that reflects either in Mr. Frick or even in George Russell in the show.
I think that's a question that we ask a lot. And when you're looking at historical figures, is it fair to evaluate them by today's standards or not? Because I think that ruthlessness, that cutthroat, ability to have no pity is necessary for these industrialists. It is necessary for George Russell to make that decision. I think the show is definitely trying to set up this conflict to ask whether or not he is justified in doing what he does, because they are playing incredibly risky. You see insider trading, you see stock shorting, all of those things that would be legal today. And both parties, the alderman and Russell, are risking all of their fortune, all of their capital, with the hope that they can come out on top. And it's George who does.
Yeah. There's only one person that can come out on top in that situation. So, and like you said, they're all in, both sides are all in. So someone is going to be totally ruined at the end of that. And George just happens to come out on top. Lizzie, what are your thoughts when you kind of picture Mr. Frick or, any of these kind of industrialists in this situation?
As you were speaking, Howard, I was really thinking about Henry Clay Frick also as someone who he may be remembered as the most ruthless of the Gilded Age industrialists because of the brutality with which a workers' strike was put down. Mm-hmm. But he was also an incredibly devoted father, mm-hmm. remarkably so, to an extent that I think nowadays would still be remarkable. Mm-hmm. His personal bedroom covered with pictures of his deceased daughter, mm-hmm. allowing his children to have important experiences with him. And he too was very unusual for his time in entrusting his daughter to be an executor of his estate and a recipient of a substantial portion of his largesse.
Yeah,
although she wasn't herself. Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I love that Lindhurst has a Helen and we have a Helen.
Yes,
Everybody's got a Helen.
Actually, yeah, it's one of the things that I would say, and this is really very true, is that, Lynhurst is very important architecturally. Alexander Jackson Davis, who designs it, is important. And it's the point at which you switch from classical to romantic architecture. That's not the reason it's saved. It's saved because his daughters loved Jay Gould as a father, and it was saved for his memory. And similarly, Helen Gould, who goes to law school, can't get a degree because there's nothing a woman can do with a law degree, is the executor of her father's estate, much to the chagrin of her brother. And so again, you start to feel these changes in the show that are based on what happens in real life. And I think one of the things to me about this in particular is people like Frick or Gould were not necessarily exemplary people, but they are seminal and iconic because these are the ways we start to live our modern lives. And one of the abilities that we have with houses like Clayton or Lindhurst is to help contemporary people understand that the things that we take for granted today are 100 or 200 years in development and the making. They don't happen immediately because Helen Frick and Helen Gould can do what other women at the time couldn't. You have a different society today, and it really starts at these places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard you say that there really is a through line from the Jay Goulds and the Henry Clay Fricks to Silicon Valley and to the billionaires and the corporate structure that we have today. I think, the laws have changed. We know there are different things that are in place that kind of control what they can and cannot do. But this corporate America that we know today really does start in the Gilded Age with these men. They made it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. That embrace of technological innovation, that focus on, increased production efficiency, you see that playing out today, and you see people skirting some of those legalities all the time.
Yeah, and I want to briefly talk too about the marriages and sort of how those relationships play into what we see happen between the Morrises and the Russells and everything that goes on. Because we talked last week about this very interesting sort of symbiotic relationship that's shown in the show between sort of politics, business, and then the social side of things. And you have, the husbands kind of dealing with the politics and the business, and then you have the wives sort of on the social side, helping to orchestrate all of these things. Howard, you mentioned, you like that George and Bertha are sort of a united front. It's a similar way that perhaps the Goulds sort of approached their marriage. I think it's a similar way that the Fricks approached their marriage. But it really struck me that, you know, we saw the kind of beautiful way or the perfect way that that relationship can sort of happen in the last episode, right? The way that all of those things can come together. You know, Bertha can orchestrate the social side, Mr. Russell can orchestrate the business side, and they can get this deal done. But we see sort of the darker flip side of that in this episode. Particularly, I think, you know, we mentioned like Bertha and George are still at United Front, but we see that sort of break down with the Morrises in sort of a really sad way, where he sort of, well, we see it with the Feins too, but he sort of orders her like, you have to go over there and you have to fix this. And that's the first really sort of pitiful interaction where, you know, Mrs. Morris is sort of begging Bertha to step in, and she is unwilling to do that. And she has that great line about, you know, life is like a bank. You can't write a check until you make a deposit, I believe is the quote. I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts sort of on that sort of relationship and how we see that play out in the episode, because I think it's a huge part of sort of marriage among these people in this period.
Yes, and again, I think this is one of those interesting things that Lord Fellows is setting up, that what the women, when you actually listen to them, what they are screaming is, we have been placed in a world that is unjust to women. And we have to figure out for ourselves how we make our way forward, what we do, what we hold as important. If we're not allowed a career, what is our place and our career? And one of the things that's interesting about the United States versus the UK and what you see in Downton Abbey, for example, is that I don't want to diminish this concept that, oh, the women were just doing the society part and the men were doing the business. This was equivalent, you know, perhaps separate, but equal is the way to look at it. This was blood sport. This was as much business as what the men were doing. I think when you look at the Mrs. Astor character, who is incredibly well drawn, she clearly in her comments, she's bright, she knows politics, she knows business, she is not messing around, and she is as much the foil to George Russell as anybody else in this thing. So I think for that period, it was really an opportunity for American women to exercise their prowess. And while some of this was social, they really did create the philanthropic universe of the United States before there was any government intervention into this. So a lot of these women are the precursors to somebody who's more famous, like Eleanor Roosevelt, who really takes it from being a private thing to being a public thing. And so I don't want to diminish how important this is. And one of the things we know, for example, is that the dollar princesses, the American women who went to England, they were bored out of their minds, and it only lasted 20 years. They get to England, and really they were just supposed to sit there and look attractive and wear lovely dresses. The American women were urban based, and they knew what they were doing. There was no messing around with these ladies. They really were working just as much as their husbands.
It's interesting. It's just occurring to me, you know, in the show, you know, Caroline Astor, Mrs. Astor is such a huge sort of force in the show. And it's just occurring to me now that we've never seen Mr. Astor. No one has ever mentioned him. No one talks about him. He is not even really present in the show, but she is such a force. So I think she's a great example of what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
I would love to, you know, Dawn, I know we talked about, you know, the idea of these marriages and, you know, the role of these women. And I know you really loved sort of the fact that Bertha and George were presenting themselves as a united front. I am interested to see the fallout of that for them, though, in episode 4. I think it has a possibility to really backfire. I'd be interested to hear what everyone else thinks, but obviously we have this really tragic ending with Mr. Morris at the end of the episode. He makes obviously a horrible and sad choice, and he's really setting Mrs. Morris up for some challenges. You know, a woman without a husband in this situation, she's not going to have a lot of options that are open to her going forward, right?
This would have been a shameful thing for her to experience too. You know, unfortunately, suicide was looked at with a different lens in that time period. So she's going to be in a different social standing under very hard circumstances for her. And I think his decision, Mr. Morris's decision, is made, all the more kind of gut wrenching because it's intercut with these scenes of Bertha and George talking, and you see George, wanting to relent, and maybe he's, dangling them a little bit, but he will, potentially relent on his decision. And that's just, that makes that final scene really hard to watch.
Absolutely.
If I could just add in, one of the things to understand historically, and you see this, for example, in Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence, the code of the day was that if you ruined people, you were supposed to disappear from society. And in reality, Jay Gould was never accepted by the real Mrs. Astor into society. The minute he passed away, his children were, but he was not, because very early on, he ruined too many people, including causing financial hardship for a number of Vanderbilts. And that was unforgivable. And you see it in Edith Wharton in The Age of Innocence, when the character there, the Wall Street character, ruins everybody. His wife, who's a relative of everybody in Gilded Age society, says, look, I was good enough to be in your parlors when he was rich. I need you now even more. And that is a big change also that's being set up in all of this. I think, to your point, Don, this is something that will haunt the George Russell character a great deal in his future, as would have been in the time period. But it is something that changes over time, this aspect of the rigid rules of how you were supposed to behave in society, because they had detriments. To your point, the suicide really impacts Mrs. Morris. It's unfair to her. Yeah. She's going to have a horrible life afterwards. Mrs. Russell, might have some trepidations and some problems, but she'll have a pretty good life. And so this is the change you're experiencing.
Yeah, and I think, it's going to be interesting to see that play out. And I was just thinking, mentioning this idea that, if you ruin someone financially, really, you were supposed to sort of skulk away into the shadows. Yeah. That really illustrates and kind of drives home the point, though, that so there was a limit to the ruthlessness. We talked about this idea that to be successful in business in the Gilded Age, you sort of have to do whatever it takes. But I feel like that illustrates that there is a stop point where that becomes unacceptable. So it's interesting that George has now sort of pushed past that point. He's sort of broken through that barrier full steam ahead. And I do think it's interesting too, he says in that moment, I'm not just doing this because you tried to go back on your word and you tried to, ruin my company. I'm also doing this because of how you treated my wife. So just to put that on the cherry on top of, it's not just about business. It's also about the personal side. And I'm going to get back at you for that. So it's quite a dramatic end to the episode, I think.
But also interesting that their moral code only extends to others of their social class. Mm. No one is ostracized because they're exploiting the poor.
Right.
And we never see in this series the basis of their wealth. Mm-hmm. There are hints, glimpses in the street scenes, even hints with things like the Magic Lantern show, which history tells us will within a few years be used for documentary slide presentations about the plight of the poor that will help to change social perceptions of what's acceptable. But their world remains pretty insular.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Lizzie. And I've been thinking about that as we sort of have been watching the course of the show. I do hope, and I think, Howard, you're so right. Julian Fellowes is fantastic at weaving in these sort of larger themes and sort of historical points in a very subtle way. And I'm interested to see if he's able to sort of weave in that of the way the other half lives in the Gilded Age, because there certainly is a whole other side, a darker side, or a tougher side to living in the Gilded Age outside of Fifth Avenue and outside of these really wealthy mansions. So, I like that we got a little bit of a glimpse of that in the Magic Lantern show. And I hope we continue to sort of build that world out to see, because yeah, it's not all glitter and gold and money in the Gilded Age, that is for sure.
Yeah, I think this is one thing that he is actually weaving in. I think one of the things that is great and is so helpful to me as a historic house is that it gets put out there in the series, and topics will go into people's minds without having to be officially taught, that they're learning something, which allows me, when people come to visit, to actually touch on these themes in a much easier way. So thank you so much, Lord Fellows. One of the things I think that you see particularly that he is trying to point out is the difference between the Caucasian society and the African American society at the time, and what it means to be an educated middle-class African American in the North. Because one of the things that we know, and we know this specifically at Lynhurst because we did an exhibit on Louis Comfort Tiffany, who was a neighbor of the Goulds in Irvington and was a radical painter when he first started. A lot of his paintings were about the plight of African Americans in the North following the Civil War. And one of the issues is that Northerners were very good at abolishing enslavement. But once that happened, the air blew out of the balloon, and there was no attention paid whatsoever to racism at the time. And I think what he's doing in a very unique and unusual way here is pointing out the personal impact of racism. When you see the Peggy Scott character with her father, and they're both educated and affluent, and they have to step aside on the sidewalk as a affluent Caucasian couple comes through, you understand very personally that history had specific personal effects on the way that we lived. And in this story, I think what we'll actually find out a great deal of is the tension between father and daughter. It's the father saying that racism has a very constant personal effect on your pride and who you are as a person. So why put yourself in front of it? Come to your own community where you don't have to experience it. And she's saying, maybe that's not enough for me. That I don't want just that, I want to combat this. And so I think he's pointing to things like that in the servants' hall, when you get the tension between Peggy and the other servants, he's pointing to some of that. And so I think he's really introducing these concepts. I once heard Doris Kearns Goodwin, the presidential historian, say that in many ways, our current society is very equivalent to the Gilded Age. That you've got the 1% today, the same way that you did. And there are a lot of people in parts of the country who don't recognize the life that is going on in major cities. And so I think it's also very relevant to what we're experiencing today, because in many ways, it's almost interesting that it's more than 100, close to 150 years later, and some of these topics are still very much top of mind. Same things are happening, same issues are being discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about that all the time, within the context of, what we're doing over at the Frick, and that, in some ways, learning about the Gilded Age and sort of learning about the ins and outs beyond just the glitter and the gold and the extreme wealth is more relevant than maybe ever, in terms of our own world. So in that way, I think the Gilded Age as a show is perfectly timed. It is sort of a timely addition to our sort of popular culture. And of course, it's giving us an opportunity to sort of have these conversations. So, of course, I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and chat with us about episode 3. And of course, a special thanks to Howard for joining us and sharing kind of some behind the scenes stories of the experiences of filming at Lindhurst. I want to make sure that everyone knows where they can find Lindhurst. So you can find Lindhurst on Instagram at Lindhurst_mansion. And then their website is lindhurst.org. I was poking around. They have an amazing virtual tour. So I was poking around on the website yesterday and checking out the mansion and things like that. So I would definitely encourage our viewers, if you are interested, to check that out as well. And of course, you can find the Frick on Instagram at FrickPGH. And I also want to say a big shout out and a thank you to everyone who's been commenting on our YouTube channel. We've had such fantastic engagement and comments and awesome dialogue between viewers about, you know, things that they're seeing and learning. And we love seeing all of that. We're trying to keep up with the comments the best that we can, but we really appreciate it. And don't forget that you can subscribe to the Frick's YouTube channel so that you will never miss an episode of the Unofficial Gilded Age After Show. And we will be back next Friday with a whole new episode talking about episode 4. And thanks so much for watching. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.